Okay, welcome to our 32nd Betting Online Sports Economics Seminar. Very pleased to have plenty of folk here. Very pleased, particularly to have Juan de Moreno-Ternero speaking today on broadcasting La Liga. A few things to say. The first thing is please do keep your microphones on mute and also ideally your cameras off as well while Juan shares his slides and while he speaks. Juan won't be able to see much in terms of chat, but the chat function is open if you want to message as Juan is speaking. He has about 60 minutes in which to speak and there's 30 minutes for Q&A at the end of that, and I'll happily park questions for then. The only other thing to say is that, as some of you may be aware, the UK has re-entered lockdown. And what this means is that at 4:15 UK time, my two children go into online after-school club rather than in person after school club via Zoom. So if at 4:15 UK time I start to get a little bit bitty and my connection goes, you know what's happened. But we'll hopefully that won't happen. Hopefully the internet connection will be strong enough. But I don't want to hold up Juan any longer. So Juan, please do take away your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, James. Let me try to share the screen. So is it working? Not yet, right?
Not yet.
Oh, so it's strange because I have it here. Okay, so I'll try again. Yes, here it goes.
Looking good. Yep, there we go.
Okay, thank you very much again, James, for organizing this, for allowing me to be here presenting this stuff. And thank you, everybody, for attending. As James said, I'd be very pleased to take questions, but I'll only have my slides in the screen. So yes, please stop me whenever you feel like saying something, and I'll be totally happy to address that, or I'll take the questions at the end, whatever you prefer. So this is actually the new stage in a research agenda in which I've been involved with a colleague of mine from Spain, a game theorist, Gustavo Bergantiños. Neither of us are specialists into sports economics, but we came into this probably because we're both sports fans and we were working on sort of similar ideas, and one thing led to another. And in particular, we started wondering about this specific issue of how to share revenues that are raised from broadcasting sports in general, with a special emphasis for sports that are organized via leagues, right? So that kind of competition. And of course, both of us being from Spain, we had a natural example to start with, the case of the Spanish football league. For those of you from North America, I'm going to keep on referring to this as football, but it's also soccer, right, if you prefer. And the case of Spanish La Liga was particularly interesting for us. And that's why we're trying to use the theoretical apparatus that we developed during these earlier stages into this specific case, right? So this is actually the first stages of this agenda. Already produced 3 papers. 2 of them have already been published. And one of them is hopefully going to be accepted soon. And I'll be probably using some of the standard techniques that we develop in some of these papers for this presentation today, but the focus here will be more applied. I believe more aligned in that sense with what's been this seminar series so far. But from time to time, I may be addressing some of the results coming from these earlier papers. If some clarification is needed, I'll be more than happy to provide them. It goes without saying, right, that as of nowadays, most sports organizations heavily rely on the sale of broadcasting and media rights. This is by far the biggest source of revenue. And in the last months, we've seen strong efforts, and you might say even somewhat controversial, to resume competitions that were stopped for during the first lockdown back in spring. Right, and as a matter of fact, that happened to be the case in most of our European competitions and North American competitions, with probably the exception in terms of football of the French Dutch and Belgian leagues, right? Among those that are reasonably well known abroad too. Even in those cases, competitions resume with empty stadiums because of the obvious concern, epidemiological concern. But the driving force to get these competitions back into process was precisely to secure this broadcasting contract, on which these clubs heavily relied for their future. And as of today, at least here in Spain, there's a lot of talking about what's going to be the future of some of these clubs if these contracts are revisited somehow because of the new situation, right? I'm not going to get into that, but this is just simply to illustrate that this is definitely a critical issue nowadays. Now, in the case of the Spanish Football League, in the case of La Liga, which was a business, multi-million euro business, with an obvious increasing trend during the last decades, there was a major turning point that happened 5-6 years ago. And I'd like to take you to that point in time to motivate a bit further what we're doing here. So back in 2014, official barometers were indicating that essentially half of Spanish citizens declared themselves interested into football. Funnily enough, this percentage went up. It was more than 67% of them of Spanish citizens declare themselves follower of a certain club, right? Which means that this goes beyond football itself. This is more of a sociological issue here, right? Following a club in Spain. And more on top of that, about 3/4 of those that that I highlighted before acknowledged to watch their club's games on TV whenever they could. So we're talking here about the big size portion of the population, of the Spanish population. So no surprise, this was actually, to some extent, a political issue. And you will see why. I'll take back this issue in a few minutes. Let me also add that back then, the two powerhouses, namely Barcelona and Madrid, were essentially getting almost half of the pie. When I refer to the pie, I refer to the overall number, overall revenues that were raised by broadcasting this competition, by broadcasting La Liga. Each of them was getting more than 20%, roughly 46%, you will see in a second. This was in stark contrast, not only with North American sport leagues, but even more strikingly, with the neighboring European football leagues. Let me illustrate this. Back in 2015, this was the situation. The situation was that, as I said, in the Spanish league, essentially the top two teams, namely Madrid and Barcelona, were getting almost 1/2, as opposed to these other big three. I'm not having here the Italian league, but it was pretty much the same. But the French, the German, and the British, right? So the Ligue 1, Bundesliga, and Premier League were actually getting very close to equal sharing, in the sense that the top two were getting something ranging from 13 to 19%, as opposed to this 46%. Okay, so you put all these ingredients together, and you have the perfect storm in Spain that actually made it a political issue, to the extent that the Spanish government decided to intervene. This, to be honest, it's something that I found shocking, right? One might expect a lot of dimensions in which the government might intervene, but the business of football, or broadcasting football, to be more precise, wouldn't be one of them, I'd say, right? But that actually happened to be the case in 2015. And it was not a minor intervention. Regulation was heavy, in the sense that in May 2015, there was this royal decree published in the official bulletin of the Spanish state. It was an 18-page long decree stating all the urgent, quote unquote, measures to be implemented. Among them, there was one salient measure, which was what I'm saying here, that to impose collective sale of broadcasting rights. Up to that point, there was no collective negotiation, right? So essentially, each club would go individually to negotiate with one of these networks to actually sell rights, having an obvious effect, right? This would have, to begin with, sequential aspects: who went first, who went second, right? So that would obviously affect the negotiation. And there was also some random process involving here that could help some clubs and not others. So in particular, I remember very well that it was in 2003, if I correctly remember, the very first game of the season in which David Beckham had just been transferred to Real Madrid. It was a big thing back then, and with a lot of expectation. So the first game, as I said, happened to be Real Madrid against Betis. And Betis had not signed a contract to sell broadcasting right by the beginning of the season, or at least by the end of the summer. That gave all of a sudden Betis a very strong bargaining power to get to secure a good deal for this process, or just to veto the broadcasting of this very anticipated and expected first game, right? So all those issues were important back then, and were supposed to be clear by imposing this collective sale of broadcasting rights. That was the first thing. Now, once you impose this collective bargaining process, there's an obvious ensuing problem, which is the one actually we got interested in. And it's how do you actually allocate the overall amount that you obtain as a whole? Taking into account, and this is how we got into this problem, because it's a very fundamental problem in economics, right? It's the problem of sharing proceeds from a joint venture when the marginal contribution to this joint venture is not extremely clear, to the extent that, in particular, in the case of, if we make the simplifying assumption that we have, for instance, just a simple game, right, played by two clubs or teams, right? Suppose that there's a constant pay-per-view fee to watch this game. So there's an amount that you raise from broadcasting this game. And this is, how do you share this amount between these two teams? It's not clear, at least entirely, what's the contribution to this overall joint venture from these two actors, let's say, right? So this is, roughly speaking, the overall picture we had in mind, right? This is a problem of sharing revenues that are collectively obtained, but for which the process of obtaining these revenues is not entirely disentangled for the different players that might be playing a role in this process. So the government was aware of this and decided to impose strict guidelines here too, to somehow drive this sharing process as well. Now, how were those guidelines? At the very beginning, there was this sort of big words that were stated out front, saying that the aim was to limit differences among participating entities by means of an equitable distribution. And I'm sort of trying to translate from the Spanish exact words. And when it comes to these legal aspects, so one never is completely sure about the proper translation from English into Spanish, right? But let's assume that this is the proper translation, what I have here in this first item in this slide. So you can see from here that it seems that the main goal was to sort of prevent the status quo, right? This very unequal situation that occurred back then, in which these two big powerhouses were getting essentially one half, right? So in a sense, this first item is trying to go in the opposite direction, right? But at the same time, and this is the second item, the decree is also acknowledging that there are differential factors, right? Differential aspects. And then when we talk about equitative, and I wouldn't like to go that far in the sense of even getting into political philosophy, what do we mean by egalitarianism here, or by being equitative, right? So taking into account the second item, it seems like this is going more along the lines of equality of opportunity, right? In a sense of not necessarily awarding the same to everybody, but awarding the same to equally deserving players, so to speak. More precisely, what the decree is saying that we should take into account for this allocation process sport outcomes in the last seasons, right? So performance on the pitch, ticket sales, let's call it economic performance that each club was actually having in the last seasons. And finally, which is what we believe it's more interesting, the relative contribution to generate resources from selling these rights. In other words, what teams are more attractive to be broadcasted, right? Because at the end of the day, these companies are going to be paying money to have a product that generates a lot of viewers for that, right? Otherwise, there's no business involved. Okay, so this is what I'm trying to say here at the end of the slide, that the first two dimensions are somewhat objective, provided we can get appropriate data, and that's another issue I'll discuss later. But the last one, the last dimension, it's more difficult to address. That's what deserves more attention, and that's where our contribution mostly lies. Okay. Now let me simply complete this introduction by saying that the decree it's saying something about this last dimension, but it's a very minimal requirement. The very minimal requirement being that first, 1/6 of the overall pie is going to be shared according to that, according to the relative importance, so to speak, that each club had on driving audiences or bringing viewerships to the tournament. And also, and this was the second minimal requirement, that no club could get by itself less than 2% or more than 20% of this dimension. So you see, again, this is sort of going in the direction of avoiding the very unequal situation we had at the beginning, in which both Madrid and Barcelona were getting each more than 20%. But again, this is, as you may expect, this is very weak bounds. There's a lot of freedom within this, right? And still, it's unclear how to solve this. It's also unclear why 1/6 and not a different portion, right? But that's another issue. Now, in contrast, the other dimensions are very clearly specified. So in particular, the decree is imposing that 1/2 of the overall pie is shared equally, no matter what. Okay, and then 1/4 is shared proportionally according to performance on the pitch in each of the last 5 seasons, with a very specific weighting scheme, right? It's 35% for the last season, 20 for the previous to last, and 15 for the previous 3, right? And on top of that, within each season, there's a very clear weighting scheme to be imposed to, depending on what was your ranking at the end of the season. I'll get into the details in a few minutes. And then there's so then we have 1/2 equally shared, 1/4 according to performance, and then there's the remaining 1/4. It'll go 1/3 and 2/3. 2/3 for the broadcasting dimension that I mentioned before. That's overall 1/6, and then 1/3 of this 1/4, namely 1/12, is going to be shared proportionally according to the economic performance, so to speak. So according to the ticket sales in these last 5 seasons. This is, roughly speaking, what this 18-page long decree is saying. A lot of things, lots of things, except perhaps for what we believe is the most crucial dimension, which is this dimension I have here at the top of this slide. So we're going to scrutinize this in this essentially in this talk today. But before doing that, let me also give a few hints about the Spanish Football League, about La Liga, which might be familiar to most of you, if not all of you, in the sense that this is a standard round-robin tournament involving 20 teams. Therefore, there's 88 games for each team, playing twice each of the other 19, one's home, another away. And in general, this is probably what makes the Spanish League special, at least in these last years. There's no overlapping in time windows, meaning that you could potentially be able to watch all the games per week, starting on a Friday evening and finishing on a Monday evening. You wouldn't do anything else in the weekend, but you would be able to watch all 10 games, right? So there's no overlapping except for specific situations, especially this last year in which the calendar is completely different due to the pandemic. There's also one issue that might play a role and that we won't consider in this talk. Actually, is twofold. One is that we're only considering audience numbers coming from national broadcasting. So we're not considering numbers from broadcasting abroad for several reasons. One reason is that not all games are broadcasted internationally, right? And that might unbalance the analysis. And also that not all games are in cable TV. There's one game per week that is on public TV. And as a result, audiences are different, we don't control for that, at least in this presentation, right? But that's important, is important caveat. Okay, let me simply say that because of this, the theoretical model we're going to be using is going to be having as prior of the model, as an input of the model, a square matrix indicating in each entry the revenues raised by each game. In this particular case, when we come to the matrix, the game played by the team in the row and the team in the column, with the convention that the game is played at the Rose Stadium, let's say. And to simplify things a bit further, and as I said before in passing, we're going to have an equal pay-per-view fee per game, meaning that at the end of the day, this matrix is going to be telling me how many viewers each game had, right? And we'll simplify things like that. Okay, so then let me. This is a long introduction. Let me then get into the model. First thing that I'm going to say is that, roughly speaking, we're going to have an endowment to be allocated among a group of teams or clubs, whatever you call them. But this endowment is going to be split in 4 categories, if you want. Overall, so E1, E2, E3, and E4, and they add to E. There's nothing wasted in the process. The process is supposed to be efficient. Then this first part of the endowment, E1, is going to be split to guarantee lower bounds, right? The second one is going to be split to according to sport performance on the pitch. Third one, according to economic performance, ticket sales. And the last one, according to these broadcasting audiences, okay? And by default, this is what the Spanish League is doing because of what the decree was saying. These are the portions. So it's 1/2 for the first, 1/4 for the second, 1/12 for the third, and 1/4 and 1/6 for the fourth, right? Again, in a theoretical model, of course, you don't need to impose this, but this is what's happening in La Liga, and that's our concern here in this paper and this talk, and that's why I'm focusing on that. Okay, so here is the first table I wanted to show. This is what happens in real life, right? I'm actually, this is the last complete data we have. It's from the season 17-18, right? So here in this season, I have the 20 teams that are ranked according to overall audience they have throughout the season, okay? That's why you don't see monotonic columns. Numbers are not fully monotonic here, but close to. You see that in the second column, I give you the exact amount each club is making, right? In this season. The next column is in relative terms. So first thing to notice is that regulation made a difference to the extent that the big 2 overall didn't even get 1/4 of the pie. So still more than in the other European competitions, but in relative terms, at least this is much less than it was before regulation. Okay, so that's the first thing to notice. That's yes. This is so far. I'm just providing data here. There's no analysis whatsoever. Now, next column, what I call lower bound, is precisely you get 1/2 of the overall pie and split it equally. Okay, nothing to say about it. Now, next column, there's some computation involved in here because, as I said, you need to go to the last 5 seasons. I didn't bring the data here, but in the last 5 seasons, you look at the end of the season, how was the table standings, right? Was Barcelona first, Madrid second, third, whatever. And then you give a percentage, specific percentage to being first. Being first is actually awarded 30%. Being second is, I believe, 20%. I don't recall exactly. I can look it up if needed. But then once you do that for each of the last 5 seasons, with the caveat that is the team or the club was relegated, you give 0, you end up having a weighted index for these last 5 seasons, and you split proportionally to this index, this 1/4 of the pie, these 331 million. And that's what you get. That's the column here, performance column. Ticket sales, here we had some trouble running into the data because we were unable to find complete data on ticket sales, and we only guaranteed data for season tickets, not individual game tickets. It's the overwhelming majority of the tickets that are sold in Spain, but it's not the whole of it, obviously, right? So there might be, you should take this column as a proxy. So there might be some margin of error here. I conjecture that is minimal though, but this is not the whole picture. That's the one. So that's the previous to last column. So again, you see that Madrid and Barcelona are obviously way ahead, right? Atletico and Athletic Bilbao are also doing very fine, and the others are way lower. Now, there's a caveat here, an interesting one. In the negotiation with these broadcasting companies, there was this issue raised at some point that it hurt the product having empty stadiums. I'm not talking about empty stadiums in the post-pandemic era or the intra-pandemic era that we live in now, right? I'm talking about empty stadiums before the pandemic, right? So that was, in a sense, hurting the product. And to the extent that these broadcasting companies wanted to punish clubs having very few people at the stadium. What was the consequence of that? So obviously clubs reacted by lowering the price of tickets to guarantee full stadiums, right? Even though revenues were lower here. So all I'm saying is that most of these not so powerful teams are showing little small numbers compared to the big clubs, but probably that was just strategic reaction to this sort of announced punishment there, right? So that might play a role here, and it might be important. Anyhow, at the end of the day, and this is what I wanted to have the focus, the last column in this table is what we call the residual. So the residual meaning what remains to be shared once the other dimensions have been addressed. So this last column is what we take as the allocation that La Liga implemented based on audiences, based on broadcasting performance, so to speak. And that will be crucial and the most important part of our analysis, because the main message that probably you can take away from this talk is that we believe there's no meaningful way of rationalize this last column, right? And I'll try to justify that sort of negative statement in a few minutes. Okay, so that's the data. Let me then get back to the analysis. So to complete the model, this is the matrix I was referring to, the audience matrix, and it'll be useful to introduce this concept, this alpha I. This is what we're going to be calling the claim of each club, or if you prefer, the total audience achieved by each of these clubs. Namely, you take in the matrix, you aggregate throughout the row and the column where this team is. So this is the overall number of viewers watching games of Barcelona, to give an example, at the end of the season, right? But of course, when people were watching Barcelona games, they were always watching Barcelona playing some of the team, right? Barcelona doesn't play itself. As a matter of fact, I didn't mention this, but it goes without saying that in the matrix, the diagonal will always be made of zeros, right? So it's straightforward to see in basic algebra that the overall entry in the matrix, which is we have to allocate in the end, the overall number of viewers in the tournament is precisely 1/2 the aggregate claim. Namely, you aggregate all the claims of teams participating, and you just have 1/2 of it, right? So this obviously suggests a trivial way of solving the problem, which is give 1/2 to each of the teams of the overall audience. Or to put it differently, take any game and split equally the number of viewers for that game. And that will be an obvious rule that will play a focal role, but not the only one. And I'll be more precise in a second. Okay, having said this, let me analyze one by one these dimensions that I was referring from the beginning. So the first dimension, what La Liga does is to split equally 1/2 of the overall amount. So technically speaking, what we say is that you take this E1, could be 1/2 or whatever we decide, so a portion of the overall amount, and you split it to guarantee lower bounds. They can be equal lower bounds, obviously, right? You just give 1/20 to each of the 20 teams, or it could be something more meaningful. And this is something we import from the literature on fair allocation. There's something known as reasonable lower bound. When it comes to a claims problem, right? So sometimes you may not know how to solve the problem, right? Normally by a claim problem, we refer to a situation in which we don't have enough to fully award what individuals are claiming, as in this case. So in this literature, there's a well-known concept first of all, this concept is motivated by the fact that if you don't know how to solve this problem, you might be minimalistic in trying to at least guarantee each of the participating players a minimal amount, right? A lower bound. And once you give lower bounds to everybody, right, you try to solve the residual. That also happens in bargaining processes, right? So in real life, when you have to secure an agreement, you sometimes go for the easy parts and leave the difficult ones for the end, right? So if you happen to be interested in dividing some kind of property, you might start dividing parts of the property for which individuals may agree, and then you leave the other for the residual. So that's the logic behind imposing these lower bounds. And there's also, again, connected to political philosophy, this idea of Rawlsianism, right? Of guaranteeing some sort of maximum level for the words of individuals, right? This Rawlsian desideratum, so to speak. Well, in these kind of problems, if that is your goal, to guarantee some sort of lower bound, you would like this lower bound to be as high as possible, compatible with the problem. And then it's not straightforward to see that the maximum you can guarantee for everybody is this expression I have over here. The minimum between your claim and the available amount divided by the overall number of viewers. By the overall number of players that you have in here. If you want to give more than that, you can construct problems for which that is impossible. Okay, so this is the maximum lower bound that behaves all the time. So in this particular case, that would amount to doing something like this. So here's another table. Again, I have all the teams listed here. In the first column, I had the equal lower bound. But then in the second column, I had something different. What I have in here is to give, so we have 20 teams, so 1/20th of the minimum between the claim of the team, of the club, and the amount we have to divide in here. Well, it turns out that if we do so, we wouldn't be allocating the whole amount we have for this dimension. We would just be allocating 1/5 of it, right? So one possibility is to scale these amounts up by 5, and that would take us to this column over here. The second column, sorry, the third column, the second column with numbers, what I call here 5RLB, 5 times the reasonable lower bound. But another possibility would be to say, okay, we give these lower bounds and we have some extra amount to allocate in this dimension. And we do it according to the broadcasting dimension. And that's what I'm doing in the other last column. So I'm saying, okay, I give you this lower bound, and the remaining part of this dimension is awarded according to the rule I'll be using for the broadcasting dimension, which we believe is the most relevant one. In any case, I'll explain more precisely how these numbers come from once I introduce these rules for the last broadcasting dimension. But one thing to notice here is that obviously we're moving from a fully equal allocation here to an unequal allocation, which doesn't need to be unfair, right? This is obviously a misconception. Most of the times, or sometimes people refer to equality of something fair and inequality as something unfair. It's obviously a simplification, and that's not always the case. What we're trying to argue here is that there are ways of guaranteeing reasonable lower bounds without being fully egalitarian. If, of course, the aim of the Spanish government intervening this business was to be fully egalitarian, you would actually impose this second column, and not necessarily for 1/2, but the whole of it. All I'm saying is that maybe there are other ways of being egalitarian here, and not necessarily by imposing an equal lower bound. Okay, but I will complement this slide in the next one. Okay, so that was the first dimension, lower bounds. Let's go to the second dimension. The second dimension is going to set performance on the pitch. So you go to the end of the season and see what happened. So in the last season, it's 35% of it. You see who was first, who was second, who was third, and then you do like in F1, let's say, right? So in F1, winning a race gives you 25, being second gives you 17, I believe, if I correctly remember, right? Or and then 15, and so on and so forth. So you have this sort of an equal weighting scheme. But that's sort of recent. As I don't know, about 10, 15 years ago, it was an unweighted scheme in the sense that the first one was getting 10, the second was getting 9, the third 8, and so on and so forth. This is like when in social choice, it's called scoring methods, right? So a standard and focal scoring method is the so-called border rule, in which you take and weighted the different standings. But there are more general scoring methods in which you don't need to have these equal steps from one to another. So we're proposing that this is an alternative way of doing things with an unweighted scheme. And also, a third one we propose is, rather than using the rankings, we go to the cardinal information that we have at the end of the season, namely the points they get, right? So it's not the same winning the tournament with 100 points as it's happening from time to time in Spain with Barcelona or Madrid, or in last year in the Premier League with Liverpool, or Manchester City the previous year, or winning with 70-something, which happened from time to time, right? Those are different performances, and we may want to reward them differently. Because let's not forget, at the end of the day, we're talking here of a product that is broadcasted, okay? So if you take this to the data again, so we have interesting differences. Again, this first column with numbers, the second column in this table here, it was happening in real life in this dimension. This is what's being implemented by La Liga. Using the alternative schemes we suggesting here, you would have interestingly different schemes with one particular proviso, meaning that the very two powerful teams, and also Atletico de Madrid, the third one, the top three, are not rewarded that much, okay? So all I'm saying is that if the concern from the very beginning was to avoid this very unequal situation in which these two teams were getting so much as opposed to the rest, probably the way in which they tried to solve it was this quote-unquote cheap way of imposing these equal lower bounds for one half, but then keeping this very unequal sport performance dimension. What we say is that you could probably have the same effect by having reasonable lower bounds instead of equal lower bounds, in which you acknowledge that teams get lower bounds, but these bounds should somehow reflect their differential circumstances, right? And in exchange, this sport performance dimension is shared according to a different scheme, as opposed to the very ad hoc one that they have in the royal decree. Okay, so in a way, what we're saying is that you could play with these two dimensions to end up having the same product, but with different rules, so to speak. That's what I wanted to say about this dimension. And then, before getting into the most important one, let me go to the previous two last, the economic performance. So we said that there was this 1/12 share according to ticket sales. But again, this was done in a proportional way, meaning that once you get the ticket sales in the last 5 seasons, right, you allocate this amount you have proportionally to those numbers. But again, here we can resort to the literature on fair allocation, and there are alternatives to this proportional rule. I mean, proportionality is well rooted in Western civilization, I'd say. Probably it goes back to Aristotle. But there are also ancient sources that can go back to the Talmud or to Maimonides, suggesting alternative ways of solving these problems. And in particular, there's a possibility of imposing egalitarianism here instead of proportionality. Egalitarianism in the way of guaranteeing equal amounts or equal losses, with the constraint that nobody gets a negative amount or an amount above the initial claim. And then what I have in this slide in the end, and the bottom, is the so-called Talmud rule, which is a hybrid between these two egalitarian rules. Okay, so those are the precise expressions here, the formal expressions, but I can give you the intuition with the numbers in here. So in this table, again, we have the listed teams, and the first and the second column, the first with numbers, is showing how much they raised in ticket sales in the last 5 years, with this caveat I made before about season tickets rather than individual tickets. And so if you allocate proportionally according to these numbers, you get this third column, what we call allocation, right? But if instead of proportionality, you use constraint equal awards, it means that you're going to give an equal amount to all clubs, provided nobody is getting more than what they were raising. Okay, and that's why you have some numbers that are exactly, for instance, the case of, think of the bottom one, Leganés was raising 0.85, and you're going to guarantee 0.85 to this team, right? But when it comes to Barcelona, you cannot guarantee everything Barcelona raised. So what you will do is to give an equal amount to Barcelona and all the others that were outperforming, let's say, the available amount, for which you don't have enough. Dually, you could do the opposite. You could try to impose that losses, namely the amount they raise minus the amount they end up getting, is the same for everybody. Again, with the caveat that some of them make zero because Leganés was making so little that it wouldn't be enough to cover this burden that should be shared equally. So in that case, what you do is to give zero to these teams and impose equal losses up from those that raise enough to be able to chip in for this common loss, so to speak, right? And so in this particular case, well, it's obvious when you look at these columns that one allocation is benefiting weak teams, the other is benefiting strong teams in this dimension. Finally, the Talmud rule is a hybrid between these two, which happens to be very similar to proportional rule here, to the proportional allocation, namely the third and the last column are very similar. And the reason for that is that the overall amount we are allocating, namely 110 millions, is almost one half the overall amount they were claiming, they were raising. That's why, and this is a theoretical property, the Talmud rule, it's similar to the proportional rule. Okay, fine. So I have about 15 minutes, I believe, to actually deal with the most interesting dimension, we believe, which is this dimension in which we share a part of the endowment according to viewers, according to audiences. So in other words, we're constructing a rule that will associate with each matrix or each problem. This is why it's saying here from the set of problems to the set of allocations, a vector. So you have the matrix of viewers, and from this matrix of viewers, you propose an allocation of the overall number that you have from that matrix. That's the only condition you impose. And in principle, you could even allow for negative amounts, meaning that you can punish some teams in this dimension. Teams that, for instance, are hurting the product. Suppose in the case of La Liga, as in all the other European competitions, you have relegation and promotion. So suppose you have some teams that were promoted, bringing less value to the product than those that were relegated. So this is like a sort of negative externality, in the sense that the games played by these new unknown teams are going to be having less audiences than normal games, so to speak. So you open the possibility for negative amounts or punishments, if you prefer. So instead of proposing specific rules to solve this problem, we propose to take a natural course of action, which is what is known as the axiomatic approach in resource allocation in general, but also using other fields. Namely, instead of giving you a formula for a given rule, I'm going to impose properties that we believe rules should satisfy. We will formalize them as axioms, and we'll hopefully observe the implications these axioms have, these properties, to the extent that when we combine a few of them, we end up singling out a unique rule. That's the goal. And that's what is normally known as a characterization result in axiomatic work. So here I have three properties, three axioms. The first one is the standard formalization of impartiality, saying that if you have two equal teams in terms of performance with respect to viewers, so each time they play a third, they generate the same number of viewers. If that is the case, you don't want to discriminate among these teams, right? So you give the same to teams I and J. Additivity is the second one. That's a sort of standard operational axiom saying that solving the problem of two seasons combined would be equal to solving the problem from the first season and the problem from the second season and aggregating, right? Very standard notion that goes back to the mid-50s and Shapley and Arrow and some of these legendary figures. And then we can have some more specific axioms referring to very particular situations. For example, what do we do if we have a team that produces no viewers whatsoever? So there's this team that each time there's a game involving this team, nobody watches the game. Then the axiom says we should give 0 to this team. Or instead of this, we could considering something we call essential team. Suppose the opposite situation, the situation in which you have a team that captures everything to the extent that if you have a game without this team, the game is meaningless. Nobody watches that game. If you happen to be in one of those cases, the team should be rewarded fully, namely getting the whole claim. So these are very specific situations, therefore reflecting that the axioms are very weak. They are only imposing a restriction for very specific and somewhat pathological situations. If you don't want to have these very specific axioms, you could have something more general and difficult to contest, in the sense that we are saying that no team should be above its claim. That's what we call it, the maximum aspiration. The maximum a team can get is this alpha I, right? The overall number of viewers this team had throughout the season. Okay, why am I showing all these properties? Well, I'm showing them because they happen to single out one rule depending on how we combine them. So in particular, the first three axioms combined take me to this focal rule that I already mentioned in passing. Just take each game and split equally the number of viewers that were for that game, right? You aggregate throughout the season, that's what you do. Or equivalently, you allocate things proportionally to these alpha I's, proportionally to these claims that each club had. That's one rule, and that happens to be the only rule satisfying these three axioms that I presented. Now, if instead of the null team axiom, I get the essential team axiom, we have a completely different rule. And this rule comes out of the blue. And I said that we were completely surprised. We were not expecting this rule. This rule has this expression here that looks fancy, and why not? But it's somewhat obscure. Why do we have this? And let me explain it in a different way, which is what I have in here. So suppose the following. Suppose we acknowledge that the maximum each team will have is alpha I, right? Now, alpha I is a joint contribution. It's a joint venture because all teams contributed to that, right? Alpha I is the overall number of viewers Barcelona had throughout the season, but Barcelona was playing the other 19 teams. So let's say that we subtract from this maximum amount 19 times something to be estimating the contribution of each of the other teams to this joint venture. And for this contribution, we take this gamma I. Gamma I being, if you look at it, precisely the average number of viewers in all the games in which team I didn't play. Okay, so I take all the games throughout the season where Barcelona didn't play and look at the viewers of each game, take the average. And that's what I associate, quote unquote, to each of the other 19 teams and subtract it from it. Okay, so if you do that, you actually get exactly what I said before in this closed form expression. That's consider and divide. Okay, let me conclude with these results by saying that if you take this maximum aspiration axiom instead of these two null team or essential team, you happen to have a compromise between these two rules. You happen to have a family of rules ranging from one to the other and involving all possible convex combinations that exist. This is what we call the EC family of rules. E for equal split, C for consider and divide. Okay, those theoretical results will be now applied. In what sense? So this is my last table, and I'd like to spend here some time trying to show what we believe is the main message here. So again, we have all the clubs listed in the first column. In the second column, we have these audiences, that the alpha I's that they had throughout the season, but we normalize them in the third column to assume that the overall number of viewers is also the overall amount that is sharing here. So in a sense, we assume that there's a constant pay-per-view fee per game, right? So that instead of talking about revenues, we talk about audiences. So that's what we're going to be using for our formula. Next column, the fourth one, is what's actually being allocated according to La Liga. And now we have here 6 new columns that come in pair, referring to 3 rules coming from this file. For instance, the fifth column is ES, is the equal split, right? This is the first rule I characterize, and that's telling me how much each team should be getting in absolute terms or in relative terms. That's the sixth column. Okay, so what you see in there is that, again, with equal split, the 2 top teams together should be having something like 1/4. Okay, if you look at the numbers, right, it's certainly less than what they are actually having in the actual allocation that is taking place, right? Okay, but that's the equal split is a rule that, if you think about it, it's rewarding small teams, right? So weak teams, to be more precise. Why? Because you are actually fully sharing the number of viewers per game. Now, let's look at the next column, what I call here C05. This is precisely the middle rule within the family I presented. That's the convex combination of the equal split and consider and divide. And what do you see here? So you see that things get better for stronger teams, right? So in particular, Madrid and Barcelona moved from having between 11 and 12 to having something close to 20% each. Okay. But the story goes striking if you go to the last rule, consider and divide. Consider and divide is the rule that I characterized in the second place, which was taking into account the performance of each team with respect to the average performance of the rest of the teams. Okay, so obviously in there, you are rewarding at the highest possible level these large teams. But don't forget about this. In all these cases, we're considering rules within the family I characterize in the third theory, right? With the family I characterize in here, meaning that each of these rules is guaranteeing these properties. So if we want to impose these properties for the allocation process, those are our candidates. There's nothing else. Or put it differently, if we're using rules within this family, it means that we are using rules that are normatively grounded with these principles here. Okay, but still there's a wide variation here, and there's a lot of options that you may think of, right? From rules that ignore the fan base of teams, so to speak, that would be equal split, sharing equally all the viewers, to consider and divide, which is pretty much saying, like, look, if you're watching a game, it's because you're a fan of one or fan of another. So I believe this is what pretty much reminiscent of what Stefan called hardcore fans versus neutral fans, right? So essentially, equal split is saying we just have neutral fans, whereas consider and divide is saying we just have hardcore fans. Both things seem to be extreme. What recommends to be somewhat in between. And in particular, this one over here, this C0.5 is the middle point. So something along those lines seems to be reasonable. But to be more precise with my statement, what we defend is that whatever it takes to allocate this amount, it has to be between the lower bound and the upper bound set by equal split and consider and divide. The equal split will be lower bound if you are a very strong team. It will be upper bound in the other case, and vice versa. Okay? So if I take it, this is the last thing I'm going to say, if I take it to the last column in this table, you will see that we're trying to determine the precise weighting factor we have to give to equal split and consistent divide to explain the number we observe in real life. And this is the devastating news. It happens to be the case that we can only do that for half of the cases, less than half, because we have 11 teams, 11 clubs, for which we cannot explain the numbers. Either they're getting too much or too little, right? So in particular, I have here Barcelona. Barcelona says above. It means that Barcelona is getting more. Barcelona is getting 41.51, which is above 25.28 and 41.10. So Barcelona is getting more than all the rules within the family might say. On the other hand, we have Betis getting 5.27, which is below 7.10, so which is below 15.7 and 20.86, much below, right? So based on this, our statement is that there's no way you can rationalize this allocation, this dimension. But again, we don't have enough information about how they decided this, in the sense that what we call here the allocation, the actual allocation is just the residual of the equal lower bound, the broadcasting performance in the sport performance and the economic performance, right? And if that is what we take as the allocation of this dimension, there's no way we can explain these numbers, at least with meaningful normative grounds, which is what we try to convey in this kind of rules. So I'm exhausting my time. Let me just simply wrap up by saying that the main focus of this paper, and in particular of this talk, was to study this problem of sharing the revenues from broadcasting La Liga, and that what we observe is that the scheme being in place might have been a good step ahead as opposed to the status quo that we had 5 years ago. And theoretically speaking, it has this very nice feature of combining performance with distributed justice concerns, right? There's I'd say a very general desideratum that we observe in real life to combine both aspects. But, and this is the big but, this scheme doesn't seem to address properly the differential capability that clubs have to generate audiences. And that's probably the takeaway message, if you allow me to say so. Okay, so I believe I can stop in here. Let me stop sharing the screen. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Juan. Really interesting talk on broadcasting. We only have one question in the chat window, which was a clarification by Alex, and he was wondering about whether you were using absolute attendance or attendance as a share of stadium capacity.
No. So what do you mean? Is it about ticket sales? Because the numbers I'm showing here is about broadcasting. So it's the number of viewers on TV, let's say, so to speak. As for the stadium, all I was doing was to consider the amount clubs reported on selling tickets. Okay. Right. So the number of people attending the stadium is not part of the problem. Let's say that wasn't considered in the model.
Okay, Stefan's got his hand up, so we'll let Alex potentially follow up. But Stefan, why don't you ask your question while Alex follows up?
Yeah, thanks, Juan. It's really interesting, and I find these exercises completely fascinating, and many of the implications are. It takes a while to sort of filter through and think them all through, but I think that it's really a valuable exercise. But I do want to. I say that because I want to raise sort of two fundamental issues that always worry me about this, and see how you respond to them. So one is, I studied moral philosophy at university many decades ago, and the one thing I remember is David Hume said, "You cannot get an ought from an is." In other words, these are ethical judgments, and it's fine that this is your ethical judgment. I don't have any problem with it, and I might well agree with your ethical judgment. But in the end, you know, if someone else comes up with a different ethical judgment, how can you say that yours is better just because it fits these criteria that you like? So that's my first point. And the second point is really more about the, you know, economists, which, you know, sort of a problem I think we have in our profession, which is, again, this is a very clearly thought out and very plausible and credible description of a way to solve a problem. But the one thing it doesn't do is take any account of history. And when most people think about morality, history matters. So if I think about, so again, I don't know which is your team and so forth, but I know that the standard view amongst non-Real Madrid fans in Spain is that Real Madrid have fixed the referees for 8 decades. I don't know if there's any truth in that whatsoever, but I do know that that's history, and I know that that matters. So when you advance your principle and you ignore the history, then, you know, how do you explain to the layperson that it's fine to just ignore that? Those are my comments.
Okay, thank you very much. Both are fascinating issues, so let me try to respond to both. The first one, moral philosophy, you're fully right. I mean, but this is precisely the what I'd say the beauty of this axiomatic approach, in the sense that you're saying, look, these are the ethical judgments I have. I formalize them as axioms and observe the implications, right? You may have a different set of axioms with different implications. All this approach is doing is to sort of move the debate from the mathematical arena into the philosophical one, if you believe, if you allow me to say so. So what I'm saying is that rather than discussing whether this formula is better than this other one, we actually discuss about whether the principles supporting one rule are better than the other. And you're fully right, that is a value judgment in the end. But I believe it's probably for the average individual, it's probably easier to have that kind of discussion rather than the mathematical one, right? So that's all I can say about that. So you're fully right. So the actions that I presented here might not be interesting for you, but then what I would say is that the rule that I'm characterizing wouldn't be interesting for you either. Then we can look for some other actions and see where do they take us. But that you're perfectly right. So we can have a lot of variety. Of course, there will be some actions that are less interesting than others, and then discussion might be obvious. But at the end of the day, it will all boil down to, you know, having your value judgments being one or the other. That I fully agree. But what I was trying to say here is that, so if you think about the actions I was presenting, I was saying, look, you're going to be impartial in the allocation process. Of course, you can debate everything, but debate against being impartial seems to be difficult to swallow. And then this upper bound that I was enforcing, so you may disagree, okay? You may go against impartiality too, but there's this long tradition saying, I believe this is a famous book by Brian Berry saying justice as impartiality. So it's like the consensus is that maybe impartiality is not enough, but it's a minimum requirement of justice. Another possibility that you may, but of course, interrupt me if you want, is that you may discriminate among equals because there might be some other dimension that they don't have equal. But my response to that would be, well, then you better have a more general model accounting for that other dimension too. But if this is all the only dimension we have, namely the numbers they produce, and the numbers are the same, I find difficult to go against impartiality. Anyway, this ends up being a value judgment. So in a sense, I'm saying that I believe impartiality is difficult to discuss as opposed to other axioms, and therefore the implications might be stronger. But you can disagree, and obviously that would take us to some other rules. All I'm trying to say is that with this axiomatic method, we're trying to sort of move the discussion from the mathematical level to the ethical/philosophical level. Okay, that's one thing. As for the second, I don't know, maybe you want to jump into that?
Yes. So just quickly, so I got so excited by that I accidentally pasted a spreadsheet into the that area, which just made me people wondering if I've gone completely insane. Sorry, that's just I was doing something else. Apologies for that. But yeah, just on impartiality, because what I wanted to say was, impartiality sounds wonderful, but I'm not impartial. I'm not impartial about white supremacists. I am completely partial about them. I do not tolerate them. I am intolerant, and I know I should be tolerant, but I'm not. And I think most of us are intolerant about things we find, and that's the problem. Impartiality is not viable, really, as a principle.
I can only agree. I can only agree with that, obviously. But in this particular setting, being impartial has a very minimal significance here. So impartial in the sense that you treat equals equally in that dimension. Anyway, but let me finish this step by saying that I fully agree with you, and that at the end of the day, it's a matter of value judgments, and you may have ones or others, but all I'm saying is that we can move the discussion to that level. Okay. As for the second one, again, fascinating, and that I didn't mention, but this model I'm presenting here is static. It's not dynamic. It's only the first step. I mean, it's on the agenda to try to come up with a dynamic framework in which indeed the allocation process you had in period T has something to say in period T plus 1, for instance. And obviously that is so natural that I can only tell you that is a very challenging problem from a mathematical or theoretical viewpoint, and that we are not there yet to be able to say something. I've been working on this dynamic models of resource allocation in a different setting, and I do have partial answers, but not enough to be able to say something in this setting. So yes, but let me just conclude with that. As for Real Madrid being favored by referees, well, I can only say that the joke in Spain last 2 years was that the VAR technology was working so fine because Madrid wasn't winning any tournament. And that was the real proof that the system was working. Now that has changed completely to the extent that this year is being completely reversed. Anyway, that was just a joke. But thank you very much. Fascinating comment, both. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Stefan. Are there more questions and comments that people have? Silence. Well maybe. Well, actually, go on, Stefan. Yep.
Yeah, no. Since no one else is asking, I think the obvious follow-up question to the first one is: so could you say which of the axioms you think is most important in your model? I mean, which one is which axiom is really carrying the weight of your argument, do you think? And
right. Okay. Yes. From a theoretical perspective, or mathematical perspective, if you want, additivity has a very strong bite, right? Because additivity is essentially saying you solve one, it's getting rid of externalities, so to speak. So you're saying you solve one game, right? And then you move to the whole season. So once you know how to share the viewers in one single game, you replicate the process for the others. So mathematically speaking, that allows us to reduce ourselves to this canonical, situations in which there's only one viewer in one game. And what do you do with that, right? And then this impartiality is saying like, okay, so you treat these two the remaining teams in the same way, and those involved in the game are treated within some bounds that is determined by these other axioms. So that's sort of the mathematical approach. Now, having said this, in one of the papers I presented at the beginning, I listed at the beginning, we also have results characterizing these same rules without additivity. So meaning that, in principle, additivity looks like the thing, but in the end, we can also characterize the same rules without additivity. But I'd say that one challenge would be, what do we get if we don't impose anything remotely connected to additivity, and that in the end will take us to something that is non-additive? What kind of non-additive rule could we think as important? And then you could think of some sort of fixed point rules, right? So there's, for instance, there's this well-known idea measuring scholar influence, right? So the so-called agent factor. I don't know if you heard. So as an alternative to the impact factor for journals, there's this idea called agent factor, in which you are sort of computing citations weighted by the relevance of the journal in which this paper is appearing. And but of course, this relevance of this journal is something inherent to the problem in itself. So at the end of the day, you need to have a sort of fixed point argument. So those kind of rules are rules that we are unable to characterize at this point, and wouldn't be additive for sure. But we have no clue as to what would be the principles driving towards those kind of rules. So
it might be something like you could think of a weighting rule that was weighted towards significance of the game for determining the championship. So
for instance, yes,
determinative could be weighted more strongly.
Exactly. For instance, yes, exactly. So you could also think that throughout the season there will be some games that become more important, right? And therefore you might sort of weight these games at a higher value than the other ones. Those kind of rules would then be addictive, and therefore would require some other principles to drive towards them. And we are not far to be able to say something in that dimension.
So you know this concept of surprise that people talk about, which is the deviation from the result from the bookmaker odds. And that would be a great way to weight. If you weighted by surprise, that would throw up some really interesting incentives in the outcomes.
Right. Yes, very interesting. Yes, definitely. That would be something very interesting to look at. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, Ian Gregory Smith has his hand up. Go on, Ian.
So I was having a similar thought along Stefan's lines, which I was wondering whether you can get a measure of how far away from a logical distribution of revenues the observed distribution of revenues is. I don't know if there's a way in which you can quantify that. So I don't know if that notion of surprise would capture that. Because I mean, for sure, there's got to be like a political side to this that, yeah, like the tension between the politics in Barcelona and Madrid is so intense. I'd be gobsmacked if the process for distributing revenues was anything like politically neutral.
Right. I fully agree. But well, two things I'd say about that. So one thing is that the whole motivation for this intervention was that they were getting too much. So even though there were political considerations, there's a very powerful, so to speak, lobby when you have all the others joining against these two powerhouses. Of course, there's an ongoing bargaining process here, because for quite some time, and this seems to be, there's some sort of revival now with the rumors last week about this European competition, right, being materialized in a few years from now. So there's always this threat that Madrid and Barcelona would deviate from the domestic competition to focus on the international one. But at the same time, you know, these other 18 teams or 17 or 16 said, yeah, but if we split ourselves, you wouldn't have a national competition either, right? And you need that. And I don't know who made this argument that I heard some years ago, that probably the strongest reason against this sort of supra international competition is that every year you need to have your fans celebrating something. And if there's only one competition, say, you know, Liverpool wins one year, Madrid another year, Barcelona, but what happens with the other, say, 10, 15 strong teams in Europe that will not be able to even celebrate a domestic title, let's so to speak, right? So that is, so in some sense, you have these two forces in the bargaining process and in political terms. But and this one thing. The second thing I wanted to say is that even if we accept that there will be political reasons driving this whole process, what I try to show is that there was a lot of freedom in our analysis to either reward these powerhouses or punish them with rules that are meaningful in the sense of allocating the amount. And they don't do that. So it seems to me like they got some numbers as why not numbers, but there's no way you can explain those numbers, not even with a political reason behind. So that was, to me, the surprising aspect.
So yeah, I was just wondering if the unexplained element could be fairly classified as sort of the political side, but if you're saying that there's this additional unexplained error as well.
Exactly. Yes. But in any case, I mean, I'd say this idea of weighting somehow the different elements we have in the model, it's really powerful, and in principle it allows for many possibilities. So I conjecture that yes, some of those routes might take us probably closer.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Alex Krumer has his hand up as well.
So thank you, Juan. Excellent presentation. I really like it, and you know it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would like to add to what Stefan said. Maybe also the suspense issue, not only the surprise, because you have suspense and surprise may also help in that regard. But there are so let's say matches for qualification to the Champions League are more suspenseful than just a game between, let's say, a very weak team of Betis. I don't know if you heard about Betis.
Yeah, I believe so. I believe I heard.
Yeah. By the way, Stefan, he's a Betis fan. Stefan asked who you support, so I. So game in the middle of the table is not as interesting as the game for the qualification to the Champions League, and in that regard, which may be a very tricky thing, is that game for relegation is also very suspenseful and may attract lots of. But then it's a very tricky situation because you'll have like a U-shaped thing. Interesting games on top, interesting games on bottom, and not very interesting in the middle. So I don't even know how to treat this one, but
yeah.
That is the yeah. So I ask another one.
Go ahead. Yes.
The second one is that you see the big teams may bring lots of money to the league, and I mean big teams that play in Europe, and in a way you want to incentivize them or to give them some prize for playing in Europe, because they bring then interest to the whole league, and I don't know whether this is something that you have in your axioms. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Very interesting comments too. So let me start with the first one. Suspense. Yes, I believe you're right. I would distinguish here between suspense at the game level or at the season level. Why am I saying this? Because we observed something amazing in La Liga in the last 10 years or so. Is that you had this sort of duopoly strategy, especially during the golden years of Messi and Ronaldo. Those years are gone, right? But during those years, most of the games were very boring. So you heard Mourinho when he came back to the Premier League saying there are no easy games in the Premier League as opposed to La Liga, right? So there were many games in those years in which Barcelona and Madrid would be easily winning 5-0, 6-0, whatever, right? You would say that there's no suspense whatsoever, and that would be hurting the product. And it was actually the opposite. So it seems like people really just love to see Messi or Ronaldo scoring 5 times each week. That was really very interesting. So suspense didn't really drive those trends, those numbers in Spain. Now, what you're saying is different. You're saying no, suspense at the aggregate level. So at the end of the season, some games are more interesting because you could be qualified for Europe, or you'll be winning the tournament, or being relegated. And I agree. And what to do about this U-shape? Interestingly enough, there was something that La Liga did for the second division. Second division has 22 teams. And in principle, 3 are promoted and 3 are relegated. The outcome, the consequence of that was that by the end of the year, there were a lot of teams with no incentives whatsoever, prone to corruption, prone to bribing. And that was a real problem, especially with betting markets becoming stronger and stronger. So regulation changed to the extent that now the third spot to be promoted is the outcome of a playoff involving up to the 6th, with the consequence that you essentially have an incentive to keep on playing until the end, because your chances of being 6th are very high in a competition like this, right? So I mean, this has nothing to do with broadcasting, but it's one step in the right direction here. As for broadcasting, I guess so, right? So if you have some games that are more crucial for the outcome of the end of the season, so to speak, then you might want to account somehow for this incremental factor in the audience. But then again, another puzzle I've always had in this dimension is North American sports. So when I lived in the US, I was amazed that, I don't know, NBA, you have like 100 games per season. And it's like each game individually seems irrelevant. But that doesn't seem to hurt the product. Of course, probably audiences are higher in the playoffs at the end. But it's like people just want to watch the game. Probably, and I say this with diffidence, North American colleagues here might say more than me, of course, probably because they're much more neutral viewers, using Stefan's parlance, than hardcore viewers in North America as opposed to Europe. So again, I wouldn't know how to properly address this in my model, but those are certainly fascinating issues. As for the other and final issue you raised about rewarding teams that play in Europe, I gotta say that the real incentive for these teams is the money they make out of playing, especially Champions League. That changed completely the game, in the sense that the budget from one year to another, if you play Champions League or not, could easily double for some of these teams, except for Madrid or Barcelona. So I'd say you don't need you may be right in the sense that these teams playing internationally will bring more prestige to the competition. But it's not clear to me, because if you just qualify once and play terribly, that wouldn't help. And if you have a fixed quota of 4 teams playing internationally in the Champions League, no matter how, I mean, the whole point is how they perform there. But again, performing well at the international level is giving so powerful economic incentives to the teams that you may not need to add on top of that. Although there might be some externalities in the case of domestic audiences.
What I meant, and I didn't say, that if you play well internationally, you bring additional slot to your country, and this is something that the whole league should appreciate. That's what I meant. So if they play poorly,
fair enough. Yes, I mean, if we are after all rewarding performance at the national level for this process, why not at the international level, right? The only caveat is that I was showing numbers here of domestic broadcasting, not international broadcasting. So this sort of, but you're claiming that maybe even at the national level, increase my so you may have an increasing interest because of international program. I fully agree. So that may be a relevant issue. Definitely, yes.
Okay, thank you, Alex. We've got a few more moments. Any other questions people want to raise? Well, with that silence, I will then thank Juan once again for a really interesting talk on broadcasting. Thank you all. Thank you to all of the participants as well. Interesting discussion. I am quickly looking through to find, and I've lost. Here we go. Next week's presentation. Hopefully you can all see the freshly minted poster for next week's presentation. Next week, same time, same place, we will have John Whitehead presenting Beyond Ghost Games, the value of attendance with masking and social distancing in US professional sports. So with that, I'll say look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks again, Juan, and hope everybody has a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.